Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, we have an RPG from the company that brought us Kirby, a game about bees, and an arcade RPG gets ported to the Sega Genesis. I'm your host, Jared, and today is May 20th, 1992. HAL Laboratory is best known for making the Kirby series and the Smash Bros. Franchise, but before all of that, they were making some pretty niche Nintendo titles: Mach Rider, Balloon Fight, and the Adventures of Lolo series. Also this week, they came out with another niche title, Arcana, for the Super Nintendo. At the time, more and more RPGs were moving away from the first-person view made popular by games like Wizardry. This was when side and top views were becoming more common. Arcana still uses the classic first-person view. Though it does represent characters and enemies as cards, it is not a card-based RPG, it's just how they look. Gameplay-wise, Arcana is a typical first-person dungeon crawler. Move around through mazes, get into random battles, level up, and gather powerful equipment and magic spells. However, Arcana also boasts another feature, being soul-crushingly difficult. You know how in some RPGs it's game over when your party dies? In Arcana, it's game over if any of your party members die outside of the elemental summons. This is on top of limited save points and spikes in difficulty, and Arcana is not exactly something that I would call fair. The story isn't too far off from what you'd expect in a 90s JRPG. Ancient evil awakens after being sealed away, a hero is the last of his race, the usual. This is naturally told us through a lengthy intro sequence. That's Kirby right there! Look, that's Kirby right there! In fact, this is the first official appearance of Kirby. Kirby's debut game, Kirby's Dream Land for the Game Boy, would not come out in the West until August. And even in Japan, Arcana precedes Kirby's first game by a month. It also just so happens that this game's composer, Jun Ishikawa, would later go on to be a part of the Kirby series. As was the style at the time, Arcana had a wildly different cover in Japan. They got this awesome piece of the main character surrounded by all these monsters and posing with cards in such a way that it would do Yugi Moto proud. Meanwhile, we got this generic fantasy lady. She doesn't even appear anywhere in the game. This box art is worse than some of my YouTube thumbnails. I've talked a bit more extensively about Arcana in a previous video already. Feel free to check that out. I'll put a link in the description. At the time, Arcana wasn't exactly being talked about or topping any charts. Speaking of, magazine GamePro gave it a generally positive review, but they also listed its challenge as beginner. I don't know what else they were playing at the time, but I'm telling you, Arcana is no joke. Another obscure game released this week in 1992 is the NES title, B-52. Now, when you think of shoot-'em-ups, what comes to mind? Spaceships, lasers, explosions, robots, all that stuff. In fact, this was so commonplace that when games like Xevious in 1942 were taking place on Earth, they were given all kinds of praise. They wanted to go one step further with that. In B-52, you play as a bee, hence the title. Only one bee, though. I don't know where the 52 comes from. You can really tell they put a lot of effort into this one. Right off the bat, the game is very unique. You're not fighting against spaceships and aliens, you're a perfectly normal bee just trying to get some honey. Your obstacles are common household pests and devices. You can even wiggle your little bee butt. Because of this, the objective isn't shoot everything that moves, it's to explore the level and get nectar from the flowers. You're allowed to explore the stages freely and even have a melee attack. Despite getting a positive review from GamePro, B-52 didn't really leave an impact. This may have less to do with the game and more to do with the game's publisher, Camerica. Camerica was known for making a few NES games, all of them unlicensed. They never got the official okay from Nintendo to make games for their console. It's why B-52 in all Camerica games come in these weird gold cartridges, and on the back, it has a dip switch that you could flip to get past the NES lockout chip. Now, this did cause Camerica to get sued by Nintendo repeatedly, and every single time, Camerica won. However, 1 year after B-52's release, they went out of business. So, did they win? Really? Sega got a release this week in 1992 with Cadash for the Sega Genesis. In this day and age, practically every game comes out with some kind of RPG element. At bare minimum, it usually has experience points and leveling up. Cadash was an arcade game released in 1989 and is an action platformer with heavy RPG elements. You level up, learn new spells, and can buy items with gold. This was considered to be really innovative because arcade games just didn't have the staying power that you would expect from RPGs. I struggle to call it a pure action RPG since it's not as mechanically deep as, say, Secret of Mana. You have 4 different characters to play as: the fighter, the mage, the priestess, and the ninja, all with different strengths and weaknesses. Cadash for the Genesis is a port of the arcade game, though it wasn't the first one. The first port was for the TurboGrafx 16 several months earlier. The ports rebalanced the characters and also made some alterations to the level layouts. It also dealt away with the pesky timer that plagued the arcade version. Understandably, the console versions only have up to 2-player co-op. What is not understandable is that you cannot play as the priestess or the ninja in the Sega Genesis version. It also has a boss entirely removed, making this the weakest version of Cadash you could play. In general, people still love the arcade version of Cadash. The Sega Genesis port, not so much. The Sega-centric magazine Megaplay would not review it until the following October, and even then, they didn't treat it too kindly. One reviewer even criticized it for having the tired save the princess trope, and another reviewer stated, and I quote, "This version offers you the privilege of 4 playable characters," which it definitely doesn't. Reviews used to make no sense at the time. This week I counted 1 SNES game, 2 NES games, and 2 Genesis games. Once again, there weren't really any big games released this week. Over in the collector's corner, most likely due to its obscurity, Arcana has seen an active decrease in value. The loose cartridge goes for just under $40, while complete barely doubles that. B-52 wasn't valuable when it came out, and it isn't now. A loose copy is just barely over $20, while a complete copy is a bit over $45. Pretty cheap, but it is an unlicensed NES game. The biggest value gainer this week is Cadash, with it loose just over $40 and a complete one at just under $190, right alongside the price for the TurboGrafx 16 version. And that's it for today. Next week, as far as we can tell, nothing came out, so we'll be off next week. Don't worry, we'll be back the first Friday of June, where a beloved Nintendo mascot gets his very first own game, a horizontal shooter for the Super Nintendo, and an obscure RPG not for the SNES. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Please click subscribe if you aren't already, like the video, and leave a comment down below. Pop quiz time, can you tell the difference? Which one of these Zelda games is actually a Camerica game? If you said this one, nope, it's a Zelda game. And if you said this one, it's a Zelda game. So this last one is also a Zelda game.